When I think about the Mercer Hugh Cosby Farm, I'm thinking about the ways that they held on to that, how they acquired it, what it meant to their family, what it meant to get up every day and work that land.
The Cosby Farm in Henrico is significant because it's been in the same family since the 1880s. It's the longest owned farm by an African American family in Henrico County.
Land was an important factor in the African American community. It was the only equalizer. If these fields could talk, they would tell us of a family that journeyed through a time of great strife. The land still held them together. The corner of our farm is where the counties of Henrico, Goochland, and Hanover meet. Mercer Hugh Cosby was my grandfather. Now, he was one of 13 children. The history that I have been able to find is that the family itself goes all the way back to about 1809.
1809 marked the birth of Celia Cosby, also known as Cella. By the mid-1800s, she was living free in eastern Goochland County, not far from an area of northwestern Henrico that would become the heart of the Cosby Farm on Pouncey Tract Road. Celia was unmarried with 6 children. She also held the unusual title of landowner. In 1846, she paid $116 for 21 acres.
We are pre-Civil War, 1846, and she is a free woman buying property.
It's very rare to find women property owners, and particularly African American women property owners. It was an anomaly in many ways. We don't find too many instances of that.
Here we have a single mother with the wherewithal to purchase property in 1846. The youngest child, the first William Darrell Cosby, was Mercer's father.
Celia had 3 daughters and 3 sons. The youngest was William, born around 1844. He inherited his mother's affection for the land and worked as both a blacksmith and a farmer. William Cosby also commanded a family that grew to 13 children, 6 with his first wife Mariah, and 7 more with his second wife Cora. One of his sons, Mercer Hugh, born in 1873, would play a central role in the farm's growth and success. By the late 1800s, Mercer Cosby had married and was eager to expand the farm's footprint. He looked west into Henrico, purchasing a 52-acre tract just across the county line. There he built a large house to raise a family and oversee an increasingly diverse farming operation.
He purchased the property in Henrico when he married his first wife. Her name was Maggie Johnson in the 1890s, late 1880s. He had 2 children with Maggie, my Aunt Alice and my Uncle Erman. He bought the property from the Satterwhites, which are still in the area. He was a farmer. I don't have any other family records of him ever being anything other than a farmer. He would have gone down to 17th Street Market in Richmond to sell his vegetables there. And actually, there was a 5-acre section of the farm in Henrico that was an orchard. There was apples and peaches. So, I mean, he was I would say, a very entrepreneurial farmer, knowing what crops made the most money. And he also grew tobacco. Now, tobacco was a cash crop.
Travel would have been very difficult at that time because of the conditions of the road, because of the weight of what he was carrying, the tobacco, but also because of race relations at that time. Anyone could be hurt or killed, maimed at any time simply because of the color of their skin. We're looking at 1880s, and at that time, we've come out of the Reconstruction era, immediately after the Civil War. We're moving into a time that's become known as the nadir, N-A-D-I-R. That's the lowest point for African Americans. You start seeing more crimes against African Americans. Lynchings were beginning to occur on a regular basis. And so for a black man to own property was in some ways a threat to white society. And so he had to walk a fine line. The fact that he grew tobacco, which was a crop that was highly desired in an area that you didn't find many tobacco growers, he was providing something that people wanted. And so he himself was someone who the larger community, outside of the African American, the white community as well, saw as a valuable citizen. The fact that he held on to the land here says something about his dedication to place and how much he valued what had come to him.
Following the death of Mercer's first wife, Maggie, he married Pretty Jasper in 1903. Pretty had connections with two prominent figures in African American history, the Reverend John Jasper and education pioneer Virginia Randolph.
Pretty Jasper was the great-great-niece of the Reverend John Jasper, who was the pastor of Six Mount Zion in Richmond.
He was a well-known orator who spoke over 200 times about a sermon called The Sun Do Move, and a couple of times at the General Assembly. Pretty comes out of that tradition, very much involved in uplift in the community. Part of the motto of the women's club movement was lifting as we climb.
Virginia Randolph and my grandmother were good friends, and I suspect that occurred during the time when both of them were at the Richmond Colored Normal School in Richmond.
Pretty Cosby was one of the founding members of the Virginia Randolph Museum. She was a real mover and shaker.
She told me of stories. Actually, she witnessed the installation of Lee's statue on Monument Avenue. She was about 10 years old, and she said that was where the statue was placed, was the end of the city of Richmond. But everything behind Lee's statue was tobacco fields and dirt roads. So if you went beyond there, you were either in a wagon, a buggy, rode a horse, or you walked. So for my grandfather to take his crops to Richmond, it would have been a good little ride into Richmond. I would say probably at least 2 hours or more.
Mercer and Pretty had 4 children together. Their youngest, William Darrell, or D, was born in 1912. Like so many of his ancestors, he came to savor life as a farmer.
He went to school here in Henrico County. He went to the old Springfield School, which was on Shady Grove Road. That was a 2-room elementary school for the African American kids. From there, he went to Virginia Randolph. He graduated class of 1931. From the time my grandfather purchased the farm, I don't think there was a period where it was not a working farm. One of the sayings he says, "I like cows in the place, make the place look pretty." I mean, that was the way he enjoyed farming.
But World War II took William far from the tranquility of home. In 1942, he was drafted into the Army and served 3 years in Europe. His experiences overseas highlighted both the challenges and the opportunities that existed beyond the farm.
After he got out of the Army, he came back to the farm. That was in 1945. Some of his friends convinced him to take advantage of the GI Bill. He went to Virginia Union and got his BS in Business Administration, and then later he got his master's in elementary education.
Many of the people who had been in the war had been to France and other places and were treated more equally than they were treated here. So when they came back, they realized they had to keep pushing. That double V campaign meant victory at home as well.
He was a farmer and educator. He did both.
William became a teacher in Henrico's segregated public school system, first at Quioccasin School and then Vanderval School. About that time, the disparities between schools for blacks and whites brought tensions to a head in rural Prince Edward County. On the morning of April 23, 1951, black students at Robert Russa Moton High School walked out of class to demand a new building. The protest led to Prince Edward's decision to close its schools for 5 years and helped launch the public school desegregation movement in the United States. Those faraway events had an indirect but profound effect on the Cosby farm. Hilda Phyllis Johnson, a teacher in Prince Edward, moved to Henrico in 1955 to escape the turmoil. Her work as an extension agent brought her frequently to the Cosby farm. She eventually stayed as William's wife.
She brought a great deal of information and experience to the farm and was a tremendous asset to the success of the farm in the 1950s and beyond. Hilda Cosby was an extension agent. She worked tirelessly with the communities to bring the education of the extension program to the families in the community.
In fact, when we think about the larger picture, looking at Prince Edward, when so many of the children were shut out of schools, Mr. Cosby and his wife made it possible for students to come to Henrico to receive an education. Mr. and Mrs. Cosby really walked what they talked. They lived the life of people who were involved in the betterment of all people. And it was through education that they believed very strongly that we would be able to move America forward.
While Henrico's public schools were integrated without interruption, the process presented challenges and revealed tensions. Before integration, William had risen to principal of the Henrico Central School, now Mayford Elementary. Afterward, he was tapped as assistant principal at Verina Elementary.
The African American principals, none of them were brought over as principals to the other schools.
Even though he was demoted, he still did the best that he could. He gave the students and the administrators and teachers the best of himself because that's all he knew to do.
He was assigned to Verina Elementary, which was on the eastern of the county on Route 5. And he was the assistant principal there. And he did mention a situation where he came to school and there were signs in the yard with various statements. Like, I want to say it, my kid's not going to school with a N-word, that type of thing. And he said the only thing he could do was take the signs down and then go in his office and report it to the school board.
The farm and its never-ending needs kept William grounded.
If you owned land free and clear, you always had a security in that if you own land, you could grow a crop, you could feed yourself. The farm held the family together. There is an attraction to the land. God ain't making none no more. There are some people who still have farms because they enjoy it. My father farmed because he enjoyed it and he was able to still do it.
William retired in 1974, but continued to focus on serving and uplifting the community. As curator of Henrico's Virginia Randolph Museum, he sought to preserve the legacy of the black education pioneer. William held the position for 28 years until his death in 2006. Then, Hilda assumed the role.
There are very few museums like the Virginia Randolph Museum, and so many of the alum are dedicated to preserving it and making sure that it continues on for generations to come. And the Cosbys were wonderful stewards because they believed in education.
We owe a great deal to them, not just for their service in education, but for all that they've done to preserve the African American history in Henrico County.
Today, the Cosby Farm teems with cornstalks and other crops, and it gives barely notice to the suburban development that sprung up nearby. Bill Cosby, one of the current owners, helped his father run the farm until 2005, when the family began leasing the land. Bill has devoted considerable time to researching and chronicling the history of his family and its farm. He and his wife Jeanette have no children, but he enjoys a large extended family and sees a future in which the property remains in familiar hands. The Mercer Hugh Cosby Farm has been part of one family's story for 5 generations, and there very well may be more chapters to write.
I am not actively farming this land. I have rented it out to another large farmer who is actually farming the property. But in no way am I in any mind to sell it. There are things in place that it will stay in the family. When the county placed the historic marker at the driveway on the farm, we had a family dedication where a lot of my cousins came. And, I feel a little bit of pride about that. That marker honors our whole family's history here in Henrico over the last 200 years.
When we think about our historic places, you don't find many that have been owned by African Americans. And when we do think about historic places, we think about the big places like Monticello, Mount Vernon, Montpelier. For the Cosbys, their farm was just as important as any of those places, and their stories are just as important as well.
It's stories like the story of the Cosby Farm and the Cosby family that really provide the rich insight into who we are as a county and where we've come from and where we're going.